The heat was merciless that afternoon, the kind that turned the Texas sky white and made every breath taste like dust. The war was still raging an ocean away, but here, near the small town of Hearn, the only sounds were cicadas, hammer strikes, and the creak of wooden gates. Behind rows of barbed wire stood one of America's largest prisoner-of-war camps. Over 3,000 German soldiers lived here, some captured in North Africa, others in France, now reduced to farmhands, carpenters, and field workers. To them, this was a strange kind of captivity: clean beds, showers, even music on the radio. When a supply truck arrived at the camp kitchen that morning, nobody paid attention. Until the cook, a red-haired man named Joe McGinney, shouted for help unloading something new. It wasn't canned beans, or powdered eggs, or army bread. It was ground beef. Joe had been an army cook since 1942, feeding men in North Africa and Italy before being transferred home. He hated waste, loved improvising, and believed a meal could do more for morale than a speech. So when he saw the beef, he decided to make something the Germans had never tasted: hamburgers. By lunchtime, the smell drifted across the camp: smoke, salt, and sizzling fat. Guards gathered by the mess hall, curious. On the other side of the fence, German prisoners stopped working and sniffed the air. One of them, a tall, sunburned man named Otto Klein, stared at the cook through the wire. "What is that?" he asked in broken English. Joe grinned. "You'll see." When the bell rang, the prisoners lined up with metal trays. Instead of the usual stew or bread rations, each man was handed a soft bun with a patty in the middle. No gravy, no utensils, just this odd American invention. For a moment, they didn't move. Then someone laughed. "Meat between bread? This is what you eat?" Joe shrugged. "Try it." Otto bit first. The others watched as he chewed, frowned, then chewed again. His eyes widened slightly. "Warm," he said finally. "Sweet. Real." The laughter faded. One by one, the men followed, biting cautiously, then hungrily. Someone muttered a prayer. Another asked for seconds. A young guard leaned toward Joe. "They like it." Joe flipped another patty. "They don't just like it, kid. They're remembering something." By evening, the mess hall echoed with a sound no one expected: laughter. German, deep and guttural, mixed with the drawl of Texas English. Someone asked Joe for the recipe. He just smirked. "You start with meat. Then you add mercy." Later that night, Otto wrote in his small notebook, the kind issued to prisoners for keeping language notes and addresses. His handwriting was careful, almost ceremonial. "Today they gave us food that was not for survival, but for joy. I thought of home, of my mother's kitchen. For a moment, I forgot the fence." Outside, guards smoked cigarettes under the stars, listening to the quiet hum of the camp generator. Private Ellis, one of the younger sentries, broke the silence. "You think we're too easy on them?" Sergeant Miller shook his head. "Easy? They can't leave, can they? The war's not here. It's in their heads." But even he couldn't deny that something had changed. The camp felt lighter, as if the barbed wire had loosened its grip. That night, Joe sat by the cooling grill, the smell of grease still on his hands. He thought about the men he'd served overseas, some still buried on beaches, and wondered what they'd think of him feeding the enemy. Maybe they'd understand. Maybe not. At dawn, before the heat returned, he saw movement near the fence. Otto stood there, holding a scrap of paper. When Joe approached, the German tossed it through the wire. It was a drawing, crude, done with a pencil stub, of a hamburger. Underneath, one word in shaky English: "Danke." Joe looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it, slid it into his pocket, and went back to his kitchen. In the guard tower, Ellis watched the exchange through binoculars and frowned. "They're getting friendly," he muttered. Miller didn't answer. He just looked at the prisoners laughing softly over breakfast, then at the smoke curling from Joe's grill, rising into the pale Texas sky. "Funny thing," he said finally. "You fight a man for years, try to break him, and then you hand him a sandwich, and suddenly he's human again." Ellis lowered the binoculars. "You think that's good or bad?" Miller sighed. "Ask me after the war." The sun climbed higher, turning the camp's fences into lines of blinding silver. The smell of cooked meat lingered in the air long after the meal was gone. A smell of something dangerous in its own way: kindness. None of them knew that, for the men behind the wire, that day would stay in their memory longer than any battle. They had expected America to capture them with weapons. Instead, it began with bread and meat. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Barbed wire, guard towers, laughter, three things no one thought could coexist. But at Camp Hearn, Texas, they did. By autumn of 1944, the war in Europe was still burning, yet life behind the fence had settled into an uncanny rhythm. The prisoners, more than 3,000 German soldiers, had built gardens, a small orchestra, even a theater where they performed Goethe and Shakespeare in translation. Locals called it the Fritz Ritz, half jokingly, half in disbelief. For most of the guards, the war was distant noise carried by the radio. Here, in the middle of Texas farmland, the prisoners were farmers, carpenters, musicians. They received mail twice a month and were paid in coupons they could exchange for cigarettes, soap, or chocolate. On the American side, curiosity slowly replaced hatred. On the German side, confusion replaced pride. One of the prisoners, a 24-year-old named Hans Lemke, had been a music student before the draft. He spent his days repairing instruments for the camp orchestra. In his letters home, carefully censored by U.S. Army staff, he wrote not about suffering, but about the absurd kindness of his captors. They treat us like humans. I don't know whether to be grateful or ashamed. The letter never reached Germany, but it was copied and kept by the censor, who underlined the sentence twice in red pencil. Every afternoon, the prisoners worked in the fields outside the camp. Under the watch of 2 guards, they harvested corn, built fences, sang songs. Sometimes local families would stop their trucks to watch. Some brought food, a loaf of bread, an apple. Small offerings passed through the wire with shy smiles. One of those who often came by was a local girl named Mary Whitaker, 17, the daughter of a cotton farmer. She'd lost her older brother in Italy that spring. Maybe that's why she came, to see faces that could have belonged to the men who killed him. At first, she only watched from a distance. Then, one afternoon, she arrived with a basket of apples from her father's orchard. She held one out through the fence. A prisoner hesitated, then took it gently, like a fragile secret. He nodded, said something in German she didn't understand, and bit into it. The crunch broke the tension. The next day, she came back. This time, the men were waiting. Someone had drawn a picture on a scrap of brown paper, a hamburger, with an exaggerated smile made of mustard. Underneath, in shaky handwriting, "Thank you, Apple Girl." Mary laughed. She didn't know why it felt like the most dangerous thing she'd done. The guards saw, of course. They said nothing. Some of them had daughters her age. Inside the camp, the exchange became legend. Prisoners began leaving little gifts by the fence, carved figures, origami cranes, sketches of the Texas sky. "You see?" Hans told his friend Otto. "They're not monsters. Maybe no one is." Otto frowned. "Careful, Hans. You start thinking like that, you forget who you are?" But Hans wasn't sure who that was anymore. The war that had defined him now felt far away, replaced by the hum of radios, the smell of cut grass, and the taste of apples. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, the prisoners heard faint music from the American side. A harmonica, playing "You Are My Sunshine." A few men chuckled. Then, one by one, the Germans began to hum along. The tune wavered, imperfect but sincere, until even the guards couldn't tell where the melody began or ended. That night, Sergeant Miller, the same guard who'd once said the war was in their heads, wrote in his notebook, "It's strange. We call them the enemy, but they smile like us. They joke like us. Hell, they even dance like us when they think no one's watching." Still, unease crept beneath the surface. Some locals hated the camp's leniency. Newspapers ran angry letters. Why feed steak to those who bombed London? Rumors spread that the Germans were planning escapes, though most of the prisoners showed no interest in leaving. Where would they go? Yet something was shifting. Hans began sketching outside the barracks, portraits of guards, landscapes of Texas fields. He traded drawings for cigarettes, which he never smoked. One day, he showed Joe, the cook, a sketch of the hamburger feast from months earlier. "You made us look like saints," Joe laughed. Hans smiled. "You looked like men." For Joe, it was a simple moment. For Hans, it was the start of something dangerous, a quiet realization that kindness could rewrite loyalty faster than any propaganda. Weeks later, as Thanksgiving approached, the camp commander suggested organizing a small celebration for morale. Joe volunteered to cook. "What'll you make?" Miller asked. Joe grinned. Something familiar. Something they'll never forget. Miller frowned. You mean? Yep, Joe said, flipping a spatula. Piece, served medium rare. The guard shook his head, but deep down, he knew the cook was right. The war might still rage in Europe, but here, in the heart of Texas, something else was cooking, something neither side could name yet. When the sun set that evening, the fence glowed red in the light, and for a heartbeat it looked less like a barrier and more like a thread, one that tied the unlikeliest people together. The men behind it didn't know it yet, but soon that thread would be tested, pulled, frayed, nearly broken. And it would all begin with the next meal. The notice appeared one morning on the board outside the command shack, crookedly typed, half torn by the wind. Thanksgiving supper. Joint detail. Kitchen volunteers. Report 0600. Joe McGinney read it, rubbed the back of his neck, and grinned. Joint detail, he said, means Germans and Americans eating together. Sergeant Miller looked less amused. Means I'll be babysitting 300 men with forks. By sunrise, the kitchen was alive. The heat from the stoves fought the chill of dawn, filling the air with the smell of coffee and grease. Joe's crew, 3 privates and 2 German prisoners assigned as cooks, worked side by side, rolling beef into patties, slicing onions, stacking soft white buns. The guards outside pretended not to care, but every few minutes one of them wandered by to sniff the air. The idea came from Joe, a war-worn cook who'd fed soldiers across 3 continents. You want to show a man he's not an animal, he liked to say. You give him a meal that means something. By noon, the whole camp smelled like the 4th of July. Smoke from the grill drifted over the barbed wire and settled into the prisoners' compound. Men stopped playing chess, stopped sanding wood, stopped pretending not to stare. The commandant had approved the plan with tight lips. 1 meal. No mingling. The fence stays closed. So they dragged the mess tables right up against the wire, Americans on one side, Germans on the other, 2 lines divided by 6 inches of air and 1,000 miles of war. The first patties hit the grill with a hiss that sounded like applause. Joe flipped them with practiced rhythm, his hands moving faster than thought. You'd think they've never seen beef before, he said. A guard muttered. Some of them probably haven't, not in years. The prisoners waited, trays in hand. The first man, tall, pale, cautious, stepped forward when Joe nodded. The guard passed a hamburger through the wire on a tin plate. For a second the German just stared at it. Then he took a bite. His eyes closed. A smile tugged at his mouth, small and unwilling. Words spread down the line. It's warm. It's real. The hum of conversation grew until it became laughter, the kind that starts low, nervous, and ends up shaking the air. Guards looked at one another, but didn't stop it. Even the officers in the tower seemed uncertain what rule was being broken. Across the yard came a girl's voice. Mary Whitaker, the farmer's daughter who sometimes brought apples, appeared with a paper bag clutched to her chest. She handed it to a guard. For dessert, she said, cheeks flushed. Inside were bright red apples. The guard rolled one across the ground to the fence. A prisoner caught it, held it up, and bowed slightly toward the girl. She smiled, and for a heartbeat, it looked like the simplest exchange in the world. The orchestra began to play. A cracked trumpet, a violin missing 2 strings, a drum made from a flour tin. They stumbled into You Are My Sunshine. Someone on the American side joined in, humming. The sound spread until the 2 camps blended into one broken tune that somehow stayed whole. Joe stood behind his grill, watching faces blur together through heat and smoke. Men who had killed for flags now stood 5 feet apart, chewing the same meal, nodding to the same rhythm. Hell, Miller muttered. You'd think the war ended. Joe didn't answer. He just flipped another patty. Maybe it did, he said quietly, for tonight. As dusk settled, the light turned golden on the barbed wire. The last burgers disappeared from the trays, and the orchestra's tune slowed, then stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a sharp sound. Wood cracking, twice, loud enough to slice the air. The laughter died instantly. Guards reached for rifles, prisoners froze. The third crack echoed, distant, just a truck backfiring beyond the fields. Still, no one relaxed. The silence afterward was deeper than before. Miller exhaled. Amazing, he said softly. Takes one noise to remind us where we are. The prisoners began to back away, collecting their trays, bowing politely. Mary was already gone, her apples half-eaten and forgotten in the dirt. Hans Lemke, the musician, lingered by the fence. His plate was empty. He raised it slightly and said in careful English, "Thank you for quiet victory." Joe smiled tiredly. "You're welcome, Hans." When the lights in the towers flickered on, the fence gleamed silver in the dark. Joe packed up his tools, the grease cooling on the grill. He slipped one of the unused buns into his pocket. Maybe a souvenir, maybe superstition. Later, in the commandant's logbook, an officer wrote a single line. Thanksgiving supper conducted without incident. He underlined without incident twice. But the real incident had already happened. It was invisible, a shift in air, a softening no rulebook could erase. For one night, the war had paused. Men who were meant to hate had eaten together. And that, everyone knew, was more dangerous than any weapon. Because peace, once it's tasted, is the hardest thing to forget. The first note was small enough to hide in a fist. A square of paper folded twice, slipped between two barbs of wire. After Thanksgiving, apples had crossed the fence. Now, in the thin winter of 1944 to 45, words did. Frost gathered on the pump handles at dawn. The camp woke to boots, buckets, and the metallic cough of stoves. Far away, the war still burned, but here time seemed to pause, heavy and watchful. Mail call broke the silence every afternoon. Names rolled off a clerk's tongue: Klein, Voigt, Lemke. Letters came from cities that no longer existed. Men who hadn't cried since Tunisia now pressed their faces into their sleeves. Others stared at unopened envelopes for hours, afraid of what waited inside. When they called Hans Lemke, he came running. The letter smelled faintly of smoke. It was his mother's hand, brisk, neat, pretending it calm. "We are alive. The house is gone. Your sister lives with Latte. Berlin is holes with smoke." He read it 3 times, folded it small, and didn't leave his bunk for 2 days. On the third morning, Mary Whitaker appeared at the fence, breath turning white in the cold. She handed the guard a paper from her mitten. "For the musician," she said. Hans unfolded it later in the yard. Pencil words, careful and shy. "You'll go home one day. Don't hate the world before you see it again." Beneath it, a crooked apple. Something shifted. The next day, he joined the lumber crew again, humming a broken tune under his breath. By January, Camp Hearn had started to look half American. Prisoners brewed bitter coffee in tin cans, argued over baseball, even hummed Glenn Miller when they thought no one listened. The orchestra mixed Schubert with jazz until the guards couldn't tell where one ended. Lieutenant Tom Brooks walked his nightly rounds, watching it all with unease. "They aren't the faces I saw in training films anymore," he wrote in his notebook. The line between enemy and neighbor blurred. A guard might lend a match. A prisoner might return it with a hand-drawn thank you. The fence still stood, but it didn't always feel real. Letters, and tiny notes, became the true currency. "Do you have aspirin?" One said. "Teach me your word for belong." Guards pretended not to see. Joe, the cook, called it peace in pencil. The town outside didn't like it. The local paper warned against spoiling the wolves. Someone painted "Go Home Huns" on the outer fence. Brooks had it scrubbed clean before noon. "We don't need their grammar," he muttered. Inside, Hans began sketching again. The fence, the shadows, faces that looked tired but softer. He gave one to Joe, a line of men at Thanksgiving, captioned, "A quiet day off from history." Joe pinned it behind the pantry door, where only he could see. At night, when the camp fell quiet, Hans played his violin under the barracks eaves. Sometimes the guards listened. Sometimes Mary did too, from the road. The music thin but alive in the cold. Then, one March afternoon, new mail arrived, thick envelopes under official seals. The commandant read the first page and turned gray. The photos spread across desks, faces, floors. A corporal vomited behind the sheds. Brooks carried one to the mess hall, where a dozen prisoners peeled potatoes. He dropped it flat on the table. A black and white image, rails, bodies, smoke. "You still think this is propaganda?" he said. The room went silent. A German officer who once quoted poetry looked down and whispered, "That can't be Germany." "It is," Brooks said. Joe came in with a tray, stopped cold. No one moved. The potatoes rolled from hands to floor, soft thuds in the stillness. That night the orchestra didn't play. The baseball field stayed empty. Men who'd traded words now avoided each other's eyes. The smell of coffee turned bitter in the pot. Someone muttered, "It's only one place." Another answered, "Places have neighbors." The fence that had seemed invisible grew taller in every mind. Hans sat outside his barracks, his mother's letter in one hand, Mary's note in the other. He stared at the dark horizon. "If this is true," he said quietly, "I don't know who I was fighting for." Brooks passed on patrol, boots crunching gravel. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed. He kept walking. A train whistle blew far beyond the fields, long and mournful. The sound crawled over the wire and into the camp like a warning. By morning, a single word was on every tongue, Dachau. It moved through the barracks like smoke, leaving ash behind. The laughter was gone now. The music, too. And yet, even in that silence, something human refused to die. 2 days later, a guard stumbled on the gravel, slipped, and went down. The first hand that reached to help him up belonged to a German prisoner. It was Hans. But that part hadn't happened yet. For now, the notes had stopped. The wire glimmered in cold sunlight, and the camp held its breath, waiting to see whether kindness would survive the truth. The photos arrived in thick envelopes that looked too heavy for paper. The commandant slit them open with a knife and went pale. He passed them down the line, to Lieutenant Tom Brooks, to the sergeants, to the censors, and the room lost its sound. Rails, barracks, bodies, a smoke that did not look like smoke. The stamp on the back read Dachau. Spring 1945 pressed warm air against the Texas barracks, but a cold moved through the camp. Brooks carried one photograph to the mess hall, where a dozen prisoners were peeling potatoes under guard. He laid it flat on the table. "You still think this is propaganda?" he asked, voice rough. The men looked. One, a former lieutenant who quoted Schiller at supper, opened his mouth and found no language. Another said, "That cannot be Germany." His eyes knew it was. Joe McGinney came in with a pan of cornbread and stopped dead. He had seen men die. He had not seen that. He set the pan down like it might burn through the wood. Silence rippled outward. The orchestra packed up without playing. The baseball lay where it bounced. Coffee boiled too long and turned bitter. In the yard, a few guards and prisoners argued. First about whether the photos were real, then about whether believing them made you a traitor. The words turned hard and ugly. 2 men grabbed each other by the shirts before their friends pulled them apart. "Enough!" Brooks barked, and the word seemed too small for the task. He doubled patrols. Lights in the towers burned brighter. The fence, which had felt invisible for a night in November, rose twice as high in every mind. That evening, Joe pushed a newspaper across a table to a small knot of prisoners, the headline shouting what the picture had whispered. "You still think we're telling stories?" he said, anger struggling with disgust. No one answered. Even the loudest skeptic, the one who talked about victor lies and staged scenes, stared at his hands and said nothing. Shame has a sound. It is the sound of cutlery not touching plates. Mary Whitaker came to the road but did not approach the wire. She had brought apples but kept them in the sack. She watched men walk in circles, each orbit private, as if they had become moons with different gravity. In the barracks, Hans Lemke sat on the steps with 2 pieces of paper, his mother's letter and Mary's note. He read one, then the other, helpless to reconcile them. When Brooks came by on rounds, Hans did not look up. "If this is true," he said quietly, English careful, "I don't know who I was fighting for." Brooks had no honest reply. He kept walking. By morning, the word Dachau moved through the camp like a taste no water could rinse. The chaplain on the American side held a service no one admitted attending. On the German side, a few men gathered to pray in whispers. Others stared at the horizon. A corporal ripped the eagle patch from his sleeve and buried it under the laundry line. Another folded his cap into a perfect square and did not put it on again. Trouble came as rumor first, then as fists. A group of locals parked their truck by the outer fence and shouted through the wire. Slurs, curses, the raw grief of men with brothers in the ETO. A stone clattered against a post. "Go home, Huns," someone yelled, and misspelled it. Brooks cleared them out before noon. "We don't need their grammar," he told Joe, but the joke had no place to land. Inside, a fight broke out in Barracks 12, 2 prisoners, one insisting the photos were Allied tricks, the other shaking, saying he had seen similar things near Minsk. The guard on duty waded in, took an elbow to the mouth, and came up bleeding. He leveled his rifle, hands unsteady. Hans stepped between them without thinking. "Stop," he said, in German first, then in English to the guard. "This is not the place for that fight." He stood there until both men found their breath. When they finally sat, he fetched a rag and pressed it to the guard's lip. No one spoke. That small act traveled farther than the stone at the fence. By supper, the story had grown. "A prisoner saved a guard," some said. "No," others corrected. "He saved us from ourselves." Joe worked longer hours that week, serving food with fewer jokes. He had begun the war believing you could cook a man into remembering he was human. The photos suggested otherwise, and yet, when he handed a bowl of stew to a prisoner and then the same bowl to a private with hollow eyes, he recognized the same hunger. At night, music returned in pieces. A harmonica in the dark, a violin answering from another barack. Not songs of celebration, just notes to prove the air still carried sound. Brooks wrote one sentence in his pocket notebook and tore the page out before bed. "The fence is back, but I can't make myself glad of it." 2 days later, a supply team from town arrived with bread and a stack of newspapers. A boy, too young for service, old enough to hate, spit at the wire and tripped in the gravel. He went down hard, rifle skidding from his shoulder. Before the nearest guard could move, a prisoner was there, hand out. The boy recoiled, then, embarrassed, took it. The prisoner hauled him to his feet, dusted him off with the briskness of an older brother, and stepped back without a word. It was Hans. Brooks saw it from the tower and felt something he didn't have a name for, a bruise flowering where anger had lived. He said nothing to his men. He didn't have to. They had seen it too. The days stretched. The news from Europe grew worse, and then, suddenly, simpler. The Reich collapsing, cities surrendering, the end approaching like weather. The camp held its breath between shame and relief, punishment and pardon, memory and appetite. One evening, as the sun dropped and turned the barbed wire to gold thread, Joe stood at his grill with a sack of ground beef he'd saved against orders. "You're not serious," Miller said, watching the smoke rise. "Dead serious," Joe answered. "We started something here. We're going to finish it." "What do you call that?" Miller asked. Joe flipped the first patty. "A last chance." And within days, on a morning when the radios announced a word no one had dared to hope for, Hans would make a choice at the mess line that none of them would forget. May 8, 1945. The war ended quietly in Texas. No sirens, no parades, just a stillness that felt heavier than noise. The news reached Camp Hearn before dawn. A shortwave operator, eyes red from the static, whispered through the open door of the mess hall, "It's over." For a long moment no one answered. Then Joe McGinney, the camp cook, wiped his hands on his apron and said softly, "Then let's feed them right." Outside, the air was thick with heat and dust. Guards leaned on rifles they didn't expect to use again. Prisoners moved like men caught between disbelief and relief. Some laughed, others wept. Most simply stood still, like they didn't know what to do with their bodies when fear finally stepped aside. Joe set up the grill one last time, the same way he had at Thanksgiving. Sizzling beef, soft bread, onions browning slow. He didn't ask for orders. He just cooked. When the first smell of meat drifted across the compound, heads turned. Even the birds went quiet. Brooks came by, jacket unbuttoned, sleeves rolled high. "You're serving them burgers?" he asked. Joe nodded. "Peace doesn't taste like rations. It should taste like this." By noon, the line stretched down the yard, guards and prisoners both. The old rules about rank and uniforms didn't matter anymore. When Hans reached the front, Joe slid a plate across the counter. "No sides, no ranks," Joe said. "Just food." Hans looked at the burger, then at the man who'd spent months feeding his captors and his captives alike. He picked up the sandwich, tore it clean in half, and held one piece out to the nearest guard. "For memory," he said. The guard hesitated, then took it. 2 bites later, they both laughed, quiet, almost embarrassed. Around them, something fragile unfolded. A corporal shared cigarettes with a German mechanic. Someone found an accordion and played a shaky waltz. Brooks watched from the tower and felt the strangest ache, like he was watching a country being born out of smoke and regret. Later, when the sun dipped low and painted the barracks gold, Joe sat on the steps outside the kitchen, wiping his hands. He could hear the prisoners singing faintly in the distance. Not military songs anymore, but folk tunes, small and human. He thought of his brother, buried in France, and wondered if this was what the end of war was supposed to sound like. That night the camp didn't lock its gates. There was nowhere for anyone to run. Guards drifted among the prisoners like ghosts of a different war. Brooks carried a single lantern through the yard, checking posts he didn't need to check. He stopped by Hans's barack and found him sitting by the window, writing something on a scrap of paper. "Going home soon," Brooks said. Hans nodded. "Yes, but I don't know what home means now." Brooks leaned on the doorframe. "Maybe it starts with this place." Hans folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "Maybe it starts with a meal." Neither man smiled. They didn't have to. When the morning came, a convoy of trucks rolled through the gate. The first group of prisoners climbed aboard, quiet, eyes on the horizon. Hans was among them. As he passed, Joe handed him a small parcel wrapped in wax paper. "Something to remember America by," Joe said. Hans opened it and laughed softly. Inside, one cold hamburger. He raised it like a toast, then stepped onto the truck. The engine started, gears grinding. The vehicle lurched forward, rolling toward the road that led out of Hearne, out of Texas, out of the strange peace that had grown behind barbed wire. From the tower, Brooks watched the dust lift and drift away. "We won the war yesterday," he said to no one. "But today, we remembered why we fight." Joe stood by the empty grill, the coals cooling to gray. He thought of all the things that couldn't be buried. Letters, songs, the smell of cooked bread, the sound of a foreign man's laughter. The fence still stood, but it didn't mean what it used to. And somewhere beyond the flat Texas fields, on a ship bound east, Hans Lemke bit into the cold burger and closed his eyes. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like home rebuilt from ashes. He smiled, and that was the last anyone in Hearne ever heard of him. When the train crossed the Rhine, they said they were free. But to Hans Lemke, freedom felt like another kind of confinement. February 1946. The railcars rattled east through a country that no longer looked like one. Smoke hung low over the rivers. Cities were flattened to ash. At every stop, women in patched coats held up signs asking for news of sons who would never return. Hans pressed his forehead to the cold window and saw ruins where streets used to be. Berlin was gray dust and silence. At the station, a clerk stamped his papers and waved him through. The next table asked the same questions over and over: party, unit, rank, belief. Every answer felt smaller than the man who gave it. Outside, crates marked C-A-R-E-U-S-A rolled by on the back of a truck. The smell of roasted coffee spilled through the wind. For a heartbeat, Hans tasted Texas. Meat, bread, the faint sweetness of onions. Then the memory vanished under the stench of coal smoke. His mother met him beneath the ribs of a bombed-out roof. Her eyes looked older than her hands. They walked home through streets that seemed to breathe grief. In the cellar where they now lived, a stove flickered weakly. When Hans handed her a bar of American chocolate, she hid it away without a word. Something for later, or maybe never. People avoided talking about the war. "Don't speak of them," a neighbor warned when Hans mentioned Americans. "We lost because we went soft." Others muttered, "We survive by forgetting." So he learned to stay silent. He found work hauling rubble for food coupons. Each swing of the shovel made memory blur. At noon, men in the soup line argued whether Germany could ever be clean again. Hans listened, saying nothing. That night, he wrote a letter he never sent. "Lieutenant Brooks, you taught me kindness. I came home to silence. We measured worth in words there. Here, we measure it in what we don't say." He folded it and hid it inside his violin case. Some nights he played in the stairwell. Quiet songs, never American ones. People listened from behind doors, then slipped away. When someone asked him to play a waltz, he switched to Schubert. That was safe. In the spring, a warehouse job brought him face to face with the word America again. Crates of canned meat, powdered milk, coffee. When one broke open, the smell of peanut butter drifted out, strange and sweet. He froze, heart pounding, remembering the grill's smoke, the fence, the laughter. He didn't need it. He couldn't. Later that day, he bought a fried patty from a street vendor. It looked almost right, brown, soft bread, a smear of sauce. But the taste was wrong. The memory it awakened was too clean for this world of ash. He wrapped it again and gave it to a hungry boy. At night, he wrote one line in his notebook. "We laughed at the taste of freedom before we knew what it meant." Now I know. It's not a flavor. It's permission. Time dulled everything except that memory. He rebuilt walls, tuned a broken violin, watched his mother's laughter come back piece by piece. The city learned to move again, slower, humbler. In 1948, while unloading a new shipment, a crate split open. Inside were tins labeled hamburger, in gravy. The men around him cheered. Hans stared at one can until someone asked if he was all right. He nodded, though his chest ached with something too strange for pride, too sharp for nostalgia. He thought of Joe McGinney, the cook who had slid a plate across a counter in Texas and said, "No ranks. Just food." Hans tried to write to Hearn once more, but didn't know the address. He tore the paper in half and kept only the words "thank you." Home, he decided, wasn't a place you returned to. It was the moment someone fed you and meant it. And though the world around him rebuilt, that taste, warm bread, kindness, smoke, stayed untouched. It would find him again, years later, on a Berlin street that smelled like the past trying to live again. West Berlin, 1958. The city had learned a new kind of glow, neon stacked over glass, jukebox lights spilling onto wet sidewalks. American songs leaked from doorways. Coca-Cola signs blinked like small promises. Hans Lemke walked with his collar up, violin case under his arm, the air tasting of coal and rain. He wasn't looking for the past. It found him in a smell, hot iron, sweet onions, bread warming from the inside out. He stopped under a striped awning, hamburger heaven. The windows steamed where people breathed. A bell rang when he pushed the door. Inside, chrome stools lined a counter, ketchup in glass bottles, a grill the size of a piano. The cook, a broad man with a paper hat tilted wrong, slid patties into a corral of sizzle. For a blink, the noise folded into another kitchen an ocean away. Hans took a stool as if it knew his name. "What'll it be?" the girl asked in English, then tried again in German. He pointed to the chalkboard. "Hamburger, mit Zwiebeln." His hands trembled. He put them flat on the counter until they learned stillness. The plate arrived, simple, almost reverent. He brought it to his mouth, and the years collapsed. Warm bread gave way to salt and smoke, and something gentler he couldn't name. The camp fence rustled in his ears. A harmonica found the tune before the violin did. For 3 breaths, he was 19, not half rebuilt from rubble and silence, but a man tasting permission again. He set the plate down and laughed once, quiet, unbelieving. "Good?" the cook asked, leaning on the counter. "It tastes like a day off from history," Hans said in careful German. The man grinned without understanding and slid a paper napkin toward him like a handshake. Voices rose and fell, students in gray coats, a GI with a girl on his arm, a woman counting coins twice before ordering coffee. Hans let the hum carry him until his eyes caught a frame on the wall near the register. A black and white photograph, sun-blown and crooked. Men around a field grill. A wire fence. An apron dark with grease. He knew the angle of the shoulders before he knew the face. The cook in the picture wore his hat wrong. He was laughing with his whole body. A handwritten note across the bottom. Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944. Hans stood without thinking. "Where did you get that?" The owner, a thin man with Brill-cream hair and a salesman's smile, came over, wiping his hands. "Ah, the picture. A GI left it. He said his uncle ran kitchens in Texas. Germans, prisoners, everyone ate. He said it made hearts softer." The owner chuckled. "Good for business, eh? Does it have a name on the back?" Hans asked, voice too fast. They took the frame down. Tape crackled. A curl of paper lifted like a leaf. For words in blue ink, faint but steady. J. McGinney, head cook. The room tilted, gently. He hadn't spoken the name aloud in years. Joe had slid a plate across a counter and said no ranks. Just food. Suddenly the distance between this chrome counter and the Texas mess hall felt no wider than a table. "Do you know this man?" the owner asked. "Yes," Hans said, and the word surprised him by being true. "I owe him." He finished the last bite because leaving it would have been impolite to the memory. Then he asked for paper. The owner handed over a napkin. Hans shook his head. "An envelope," he said, "and a stamp." He wrote at a corner table, back to the door, letters forming as if they had practiced without him. "Sir, you may not remember me. I was a prisoner at Hearn, Texas. You made hamburgers on a night when the fence felt invisible. I have carried that taste through ruins and winters. Today, in Berlin, I found it again. If you are Joe McGinney, know that your food taught me to believe people can start over. Do you still make them? He paused, pen hovering. Where do I send it? He asked the owner. The man spread his hands. America is large, but soldiers talk. Try the Red Cross. Or write Hearn, Texas, on the front and give luck something to do. Hans folded the page carefully, as if paper could bruise, and slid it into an envelope. The stamp stuck slightly crooked. He pressed it flat with his thumb, sudden heat behind the eyes. Not grief, but the ache of a bridge finally visible. Outside, rain tapped a slow syncopation on the awning. He stood under it with the letter in his coat pocket and looked back through the glass. The photo was up on the wall again, slightly more crooked, as if it had leaned toward him to be heard. He walked to the post office with the steady pace of a man crossing a narrow plank. The clerk eyed the foreign address, stamped it twice, and tossed it into a bin that clanged like a bell. On the sidewalk, Berlin smelled of wet stone and gasoline. Somewhere a radio drifted through blue suede shoes, and a tram bell answered like a joke. Hans touched the corner of the envelope through his coat and felt, absurdly, that he was holding a ticket. He turned toward home, counting the steps without noticing. At the next corner, he stopped, went back into hamburger heaven, and pointed to the photo again. What was the soldier's name who left it? He asked. The owner frowned, thinking. He said his uncle's first name was Jack. Or Joe. He laughed at his own confusion. Joe, Hans said. Yes. The owner nodded. He said his uncle always kept one rule in the kitchen, no sides, just food. Hans closed his eyes and let the sentence land. That night, he dreamed of a grill glowing like a small sun and a hand sliding a plate across the border between then and now. When he woke, the taste was still there. Weeks would pass, trains would run, letters would cross an ocean with the stubbornness of hope. And one morning, an envelope with Texas dust ground into its fibers would slide through his door. The letter took months to cross the ocean, handled, stamped, tossed into sacks, and carried on a ship that smelled of oil and rust. When it finally reached Texas, the envelope was thin and patient. Inside, 6 words in careful script. Do you still make them? Joe McGinney read it in the corner of his roadside cafe, a place small enough that every fry knew its way around the pan. His hands were dark with grease, his apron scorched at the edges. The name at the bottom, Hans Lemke, stopped him cold. For a long moment, he heard the wind against the wire fence again, the laughter, the smell of wood smoke. That night, under the weak hum of the neon sign, he wrote back, Yes, come if you can. I'll be here. Months later, in the Texas heat, a bus hissed to a stop outside the cafe. A thin man stepped down, carrying a violin case and a folded coat. Joe looked up from the grill and froze. Time, for once, doing what it was told. They didn't shake hands. They just looked at each other, then laughed quietly, the sound of 2 men recognizing something the world had forgotten. Still making them? Hans asked, his German softened by years. Every day, Joe said. Sit. He worked the grill like a prayer. Salt, smoke, onions, the hiss of fat. When the burger hit the plate, it wasn't nostalgia, it was a reunion. Hans took a bite, eyes closing. It tastes the same, he whispered. That's the point, Joe replied. They spoke in half sentences, about Berlin rebuilt from rubble, about the mother who never learned to forgive, about soldiers who turned to farmers and never spoke of the war again. Joe told him about the guards, about Lieutenant Brooks selling tractors in Oklahoma, about how quiet peace could feel once it stopped trying to prove itself. Later, they drove to where the camp had stood. The towers were gone, replaced by a field and a wind that remembered everything. Hans walked to the invisible fence and stood there with his hands in his pockets. He opened his violin case, tuned by instinct, and played, a simple melody, half sorrow, half gratitude. Joe listened with his hat in his hands. When it ended, neither man clapped. The silence finished the song for them. Back at the cafe, Joe pulled a folded photograph from under the counter, the old camp picture. The grill, the guards, the prisoners, the girl with the apples. He slid it across. Mary married, he said. Moved north. She sent me a Christmas card once. 2 kids, and a tree too big for the room. Hans smiled faintly. Tell her. No, she already knows. They stayed until the light went gold and the jukebox hummed low. Joe flipped the sign to closed, then changed his mind and turned it back to open. One more, he said. They ate without words, two men on opposite sides of a war, sharing the same warmth. At dawn, Hans boarded a bus for the city. He left behind a letter under the register, neatly folded. Empires fall, flags fade, but a meal can remind us what we almost forgot. That kindness doesn't wear a uniform. Weeks later, a small notice appeared in the Herne Democrat. Former POW visits local cafe. Few paid attention, but one woman clipped it, sent it to the county museum, and a year later a small display appeared. A spatula, a photo, and a placard that read, "The Taste of Peace." By then, Joe had passed. Hans lived quietly in Hamburg, teaching children music. He never told them where he'd learned the song he played most often. And yet, sometimes, late at night, when the last note faded, he swore he could smell it again. Warm bread, smoke, and the faint sweetness of forgiveness. Because peace, he decided, doesn't begin with treaties or flags. It begins when one man slides a plate across a table and another man says thank you.